समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
If Donald Trump's Liberation Day tariff trapeze has left you frustrated, you're not alone. The reality of Trump's reciprocal tariffs is so far from economic logic, we could already be living in a simulation. Now, these are the harshest and the most restrictive trade measures undertaken by any US administration in decades. And they have disrupted trade liberalization that had shaped the global economic order after the Second World War. Now, all day on 2nd April, certain numbers kept flashing across screens worldwide, displaying what is at best a ridiculous reciprocal tantrum, not a real economic policy. But first, how did the US come up with those numbers? Let's decode this reciprocal tariff chutzpah. One of the most astounding aspects of Trump's reciprocal tariff strategy is the formula they have invented for getting there. Now, Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick's team has calculated tariffs based on the ratio of the US trade deficit with a country versus the total trade with that country. However, this formula is a measure of trade imbalance, not of trade barriers. So there's a difference between trade imbalance and trade barriers. This is the first and, in my opinion, the most fundamental flaw in the strategy, because a trade imbalance doesn't inherently reflect trade barriers or the reasons for it. Now, trade imbalances exist between rich and poor countries as a natural outcome of global economic disparities. Wealthier nations generally have lower tariffs, while poorer countries tend to impose higher tariffs. And this imbalance has little to do with trade barriers and everything to do with economic developmental levels. Now, in response to Trump's tariff drama, former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt aptly pointed out on his post on the X that low tariffs foster trade and trade drives growth, which in turn creates prosperity. Coming back, the Trump administration's misguided belief that applying a uniform magic number formula could somehow level the playing field fails to recognize these differences. For instance, if the goal was truly to address trade imbalances, reciprocal tariffs should have identified specific trade barriers contributing to disparities, instead of using generalized numbers based on trade deficit. It just doesn't make sense. Now here, let me give you an example. You know that India is negotiating an FTA, like a free trade agreement, with the EU, where market access is a thorny issue. Now, another problem that we are facing there is India's misgivings and concerns around what is known as the CBAM, or the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will levy more tax on Indian steel and iron exports to the EU due to increased carbon leakage here. Now, identifying this pattern, the EU has been making a case for unlocking climate financing for India to build technological advancement to prevent carbon leakage and address structural misgivings around a trade policy that is acting as a trade barrier. Now, I think you understand that by contrast, Trump's tariff trapeze is tone deaf and it seems to be calculated at pure whim. Before I go further, check this out. Trump's reciprocal tariffs have more prologue and epilogue to make them into an even bigger bluster. The reciprocal tariffs announced on 2nd April were halved because the US, in Trump's words, was just being so kind. Basically, the president gave a 50% discount on the magic number that anyway didn't reflect trade barriers. Now, these do seem like bizarre diplomatic theatrics. However, just so others should not take America's divine kindness for granted, Trump had already imposed a sweeping baseline tariff of 10% on virtually all countries. So what does that mean? The reciprocal tariffs announced on Liberation Day, which is 2nd April, with a 50% discount come over and above the 10% already in place. And in cases like China, they actually add up to the previously existing tariffs, taking the final score to unprecedented heights of economic self-delusion. Now, at this juncture, let us take a moment to reflect and recognize that all this addition to tariffs will finally be paid by the American consumers, not the MAGA cult. And despite this, Trump's MAGA supporters have cheered on each nonsensical proclamation, sadly at the expense of both the US and its partners. While the Trump administration claims these tariffs will punish foreign countries, the truth is that American consumers and actors across the supply chain will pay the price. The immediate fallout from Trump's tariff announcements was a dramatic sell-off in global stock markets. The S&P 500 plunged nearly 5%, making its worst single-day decline since the COVID-19 pandemic. In Asia, Japan's Nikkei index dropped to its lowest level in 8 months, and European stocks futures also took a significant hit. Investors flocked to the safety of bonds and gold as economists warned that the long-term cost of these tariffs could exceed $30 trillion. Now, this economic turmoil was accompanied by a dip in Trump's approval ratings, which fell to a 43%. And you know what? This has been the lowest since he took office. Now, if the stock market continues to slide, it's likely that his approval ratings will decline even further. Now, let me tell you about yet another issue that got everyone's attention: Trump's soft corner for Putin. Russia was not on that list. Unlike what many would like to believe, going by misleading statements made by United States trade representatives, the US-Russia bilateral trade is not zero because of Biden-era sanctions. Now, quite a few people in India seemed to be under the impression that there is no trade between the two due to sanctions and therefore no tariffs. But that's not the case. The US and Russia continue to have bilateral trade, although this significantly plunged from a $35 billion before the Ukraine war to a $3.5 billion now. Another misnomer is that whatever trade exists between Russia and the US are all about critical minerals. Now, that again is not totally true. The 3 main items on the trade list, which means the bilateral trade list, are nitrogenous fertilizers, which is not a critical mineral, followed by radioactive chemicals and uranium. The interesting bit is Russia continues to have an export surplus with the US. And even if the uranium exports are given a waiver due to their sensitive nature, there is still room for putting reciprocal tariffs if Donald Trump wanted. Because it is the same logic that he applied to other countries with far lesser and in some cases with no trade. It has gone to bizarre levels. You know what he has done? He has put tariffs on his own military base in Diego Garcia and even on 2 remote Antarctic outposts inhabited by penguins and seals. And that is why you see so many penguin memes lately. But then there's even more inconsistency. For instance, countries like Syria that remain heavily sanctioned by the US are mentioned on the reciprocal tariff list, while other sanctioned countries like Russia, I just gave you an example about, Belarus and North Korea, etc. are not. Now, Canada and Mexico that are not really sanctioned have still not been mentioned on the list because their negotiations are being done in a different framework. But that aside, the most glaring setback is on the ongoing efforts to build resilience of supply chains. These reciprocal tariffs fuel global dependency on China rather than creating conditions for diversifying away from it. For instance, Vietnam is now imposed with 46% tariffs, which will have a serious bearing on investors that moved production chains from China to Vietnam for creating resilience. So finally, I'm sure you have a question. What about India? Now, from the beginning of Trump's presidency in January this year, India has made several efforts to appease the US and avoid being caught in the crossfire of his tariff policies. We have reduced tariffs on thousands of items imported from the US, and these items are valued at $23 billion. Not many in India perhaps know that Indian companies have invested approximately $40 billion in the US economy. New Delhi has also promised to buy more hydrocarbons, also more weapons, including military equipment like the Strikers, which are armored infantry vehicles that are not really necessarily needed in India because we have a domestic option available. These concessions were made in an effort to reduce the trade surplus that India currently enjoys with the US, which is about $40 to $45 billion. In fact, going against the local automakers' requests, India seems pretty serious about cutting down on tariffs on EVs because Mr. Donald Trump wants it in the trade deal that both sides are now working on. Now, this trade deal needs to close soon and should be ready to be announced as Donald Trump visits India for the Quad Summit in October 2025 or around that time. But despite these humongous efforts, Trump's tariffs have been unleashed on India exactly the way they have been unleashed on everyone else, leaving New Delhi with little to show for its concessions or for its strategic autonomy. There is one more important factor here. India's navigation of the chaos of Trump's tariff game is compounded by its own economic shortcomings. While countries like Vietnam and Singapore have so far capitalized on shifting supply chains away from China, India has failed to attract a meaningful share of this diversified investment, a point I have repeatedly made. The complexities of India's regulatory environment and uncompetitive ecosystem have made it difficult for the country to become a real investment destination. As a result, even as tariffs on China escalate, India remains far behind in terms of competitive manufacturing and foreign direct investment. But despite all these challenges, there is some silver lining. The key to India benefiting from the disruption caused by Trump's tariffs lies in implementing internal reforms. Without structural changes to improve its manufacturing sector and make its sensitive industries more competitive, India will continue to fall behind the global economic race. The government's production-linked incentives, or the PLI schemes. Now, these are well-meaning, but these will not be effective on their own. They must be a part of a broader effort to create a more investment-friendly environment. India's ability to attract foreign investment is going to depend on its ability to simplify regulations, enhance infrastructure, and create a competitive business ecosystem. And really, I think it's high time. Therefore, despite the challenges, there is hope for India to navigate this turbulent period. US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has advised countries to weather the storm and avoid retaliating against Trump's tariffs. Now, many countries have chosen to not listen to him. But India's measured response, which has been to avoid direct retaliation, shows a recognition of the need to stay put and focus on internal reforms. If New Delhi can successfully overhaul its sluggish economic ecosystem and regulatory bottlenecks, it may be able to ride out the storm and emerge stronger in the longer run. I will be back to discuss more from the Trumpian disorder and its discontent. Stay tuned.